Hey guys, Kid Aikino here. So, I've got this whole huge video on the Criterion Godzilla box set coming out, but since it's been a while since I did much of anything on this channel, I figured I'd do a little something extra as well. Given the timing, it seems appropriate to do something Halloween related. I've been getting in the spirit of the season by watching the new Mill Creek Ultra Q Blu-ray set, and I've been loving it so far. But I'm not done with the series yet, and I don't really have that much to say about it just yet. So instead I'm going to step a little bit outside my usual wheelhouse and talk about my favorite horror franchise, the Sleepaway Camp films. Now, I'm not usually a huge horror fan. I find it conceptually interesting in the same way I find a lot of other genre fiction interesting, but the horror films that really actually grab me are usually the ones that are in some way novel or unique even within the genre itself. Found footage is a big one for me thanks to Cloverfield. Cannibal Holocaust is interesting to me, both for doing found footage decades before it became a big thing, and for the social commentary that tends to be overshadowed by its controversial history. The web series Marble Hornets is interesting for how it combines the aesthetics of found footage horror with the form of a YouTube vlog and an in-character social media presence to turn the story into something of an alternate reality game. There's also the home movie quality of no-budget shot-on VHS horror films from the 80s, like Violent Shit and Blood Lake. The Sleepaway Camp films are interesting to me because they're part of the horror subgenre that's probably the least known for uniqueness or novelty, and the most widely regarded as predictable and formulaic, the slasher film. These are what Roger Ebert derisively referred to as dead teenager movies, and pretty much anyone can rattle off the tropes. You have a cast of victims, usually teenagers, isolated either socially or geographically. You have a killer who picks them off in novel and interesting ways. The characters who get killed have often committed some kind of moral transgression, drinking, drugs, premarital sex, with the one left standing at the end usually having abstained from the other's vices. And aside from being formulaic, slasher movies are the popular cinema most frequently acknowledged as being commodities. Not many film series keep chugging along, cranking out new entries into the double digits, but a lot of the ones that do are slasher franchises. People will passionately defend the artistic merits and aspirations of the MCU, or the continued political and cultural relevance of the James Bond series, but saying that slasher films are just product is generally less controversial. Now, of course, no genre is quite that simple, and that last bit is definitely selling them short, but even fans will tend to acknowledge that the reputation of slasher films isn't completely unearned. And I'm certainly not immune. I'm not all that interested in watching and seeking out slasher films, and the few I have seen haven't done much to change that. So, what about the Sleepaway Camp films is so interesting to me? Let's briefly look at these films, and yes, there are going to be spoilers. Sleepaway Camp is a 1983 film in which a shy orphan named Angela and her foul-mouthed but loyal cousin Ricky come to spend the summer at Camp Arawak. Angela is quiet, withdrawn, and awkward, quickly becoming the target of harassment by other campers, despite Ricky's best efforts to protect her. Campers begin turning up dead, first in suspicious accidents and later in obvious murders. Tensions and suspicions among the campers and staff escalate until the killer is finally identified as Angela, who is also discovered to have been Angela's brother, adopted and raised as his deceased sister after the accident in which he was orphaned. Sleepaway Camp was followed by two sequels shot back-to-back and released in 1988 and 89. In the second film, Unhappy Campers, Angela resurfaces as a counselor at Camp Rolling Hills after being institutionalized and released following extensive therapy and a full gender transition. She takes to the job with great enthusiasm, murdering campers who break the rules, and eventually killing virtually the entire population of campers and staff. In the third, Teenage Wasteland, the camp from the previous film is reopened as Camp New Horizons, where poor inner-city teenagers are placed in groups with rich kids in what's presented as an attempt to provide a learning experience. Angela takes the place of one of the poor campers, gradually killing off both the campers and the incompetent, apathetic staff. I think what's so interesting to me about Sleepaway Camp is largely due to its status as an independent film. The writer and director Robert Hiltzik decided to make a horror film mainly because it was the easiest way to get his first feature funded, and shot it independently at a summer camp he attended as a child. It's that personal touch and the creation of the film outside the Hollywood establishment that I think makes it so interesting and idiosyncratic. For one thing, it's as much a love letter to summer camp as it is a horror film. Not that it half-asses the horror element, the kills are inventive and memorable, if not often that explicit, but a lot of scenes depict the experience of summer camp in loving detail. There's an unmistakable sense of genuine nostalgia in scenes of characters reuniting and catching up with friends from the previous summer, of long afternoons playing games, of practical jokes and camaraderie among campers, and of the drama of adolescent romance. This may be the first slasher film in which, instead of the other way around, the killing spree is an excuse to depict a summer at camp. There's also the cast. The film is hardly a work of hard realism, but there's a certain verisimilitude to the whole thing thanks to the casting choices that would probably have been unlikely within the studio system. For one thing, the teenagers in this film are generally played by actual teenagers. Felissa Rose was 13, Jonathan Tiersten was 17, Christopher Calais was 14, and Catherine Cammey was 18. I can't find anything on Karen Fields, but that's most of the main cast of campers right there. It's also very un-Californian. The film was shot in upstate New York with a cast of New Yorkers, as evidenced by some of the accents.
Daddy, tell me to leave me alone. Peter started it. I did not, you liar. Did too.
How about if you and me take a walk into the kitchen, see if we can find you something you like?
And unwaspy. A lot of the cast are vaguely ethnically ambiguous in appearance, with Chris Calais being possibly the only member of the core cast with what could be considered typical Hollywood looks. Aside from that, though, there's also the fact that near the middle of the Reagan years, and in a genre largely aimed at and reflecting the sensibilities of a straight audience, Sleepaway Camp seems surprisingly gay. And I'm not just talking about the twist with Angela, or the foreshadowing of the twist with Angela and Peter witnessing their father in bed with his partner Lenny, but there is what seems like an unusual current of homoeroticism underlying a lot of the film more generally. I mean, consider the costumes. Gino, one of the counselors, is introduced in a cropped camp t-shirt, and later appears in a blue mesh shirt. Ronnie's costumes seem to deliberately show off his bodybuilder's physique, including a pair of shorts that inspire gratitude for the film having been neither shot in 3D nor graced by the more recent fad for converting 2D films to the format. There's also Billy's shorts during the extended softball sequence, the effect of which is really only increased by the intense macho posturing in that scene. In general, there's a lot of male bodies being shown off here, contrasted with the comparatively conservative outfits of the girls. On top of that, you've got the mind over matter prank, the male bonding dog pile that follows the other guys teasing Paul about hitting it off with Angela, and of course what I believe Brad Jones called a parade of man-ass in a skinny dipping scene. Mind you, there's no female nudity in this movie. Aside from that, there's also the fact that none of the heterosexual relationships in this film are really that easy to root for. Ricky's bitterness over losing Judy's favor and attempts to get her back are at best confusing, as she's a thoroughly unpleasant and unlikable character, to say nothing of her antagonism of Angela, of whom Ricky, for all his abrasiveness, is fiercely loyal and protective. There's also the flirtation between Meg and Mel, which, doesn't require much elaboration. Finally, there's the main romance between Angela and Ricky's best friend, Paul. Paul initially comes off as kind of the sensitive, nice guy, comforting Angela after she's been harassed by a couple of the older boys, and being the first person besides Ricky to really just talk to her like a normal person, which in turn brings her out of her shell a bit. But he quickly turns out to be kind of an asshole. He pushes Angela's boundaries physically, gets mad at her when she doesn't immediately get over it, and then immediately turns around and is seduced by Judy with seemingly little effort. He also abandons Angela to be tormented by Meg and Judy twice. The second time it's after Judy embarrasses him with something he said about Angela, but the first time it's for no clear reason at all.
Here comes the Wicked Witch of the West. I think I'm gonna go back into the water. Talk to you later, Angela.
What a little shit. Now listen, I don't know if Hiltzik is gay, and I've seen nothing in the wealth of behind-the-scenes materials and interviews on Shout Factory's Blu-ray of the film to indicate that he is, and some of the costumes could just be a product of their time. But there's kind of a lot happening with this film, and the combined effect is pretty striking. Sleepaway Camp in general seems largely uninformed by the sensibilities typically associated with slasher films as a subgenre. It's an offbeat, unrefined, and fascinatingly sincere indie gem, and it'll probably always be a favorite of mine. The sequels are pretty much the exact opposite. Aside from not really being products of the mainstream studio system, they're generic slasher movies in pretty much every way the original film wasn't. They almost play as self-parody, with Angela released from the psych ward, an outgoing and chipper slasher who wisecracks her way through her killing sprees. There's hair metal all over the soundtracks. Where the original went out of its way to populate the camp with actual teenagers, the Dawson casting in the sequels is shameless, which probably has something to do with the next point. The sequels are full of gratuitous female nudity and generally oversexed campers and staff alike. The characters in the first film were no Puritans, of course, but the sequels really double down on that side of things. Now, whether it holds true for the majority of them or not, slasher films are known for a kind of implicit Reaganite morality, where the killings are preceded by the victims drinking, doing drugs, having sex, a justification for the killings that isn't acknowledged aloud, but is clear enough that it's popularly associated with the slasher genre anyway. Whether this unspoken conservatism reflected actual biases on the part of the filmmakers, or was meant to preempt challenges to their films in a conservative environment amid the dual Reagan and Thatcher administrations, and widespread moral panics over Satanism and heavy metal, it still informed the way the films were written, and it's the way that tendency manifests in the Sleepaway Camp sequels that makes them interesting to me. Angela in the sequels is an explicit enforcer of the kind of straight-laced morality implied by other slashers, taking an extremely judgmental view of anyone who violates it or otherwise breaks the rules at camp, and usually murdering them. The second film first establishes some backstory, as explained by himbo Charlie Kirk here.
He went into a psycho ward a couple years ago, and while he was there, the doctors gave him a sex change, and our parents' taxes paid for it.
The rest of the film sees Angela outraged at various campers' immodesty, intoxication, lack of respect for authority, and general rowdiness, usually following up with a novel murder and at least one one-liner. Toward the end of the film, Angela has a well-behaved camper she's been counseling throughout the film captive in an abandoned cabin, along with her love interest Turning Point Camp Rolling Hills. She explains to them her rehabilitation and justifies what she's doing at the camp thusly.
I did my time. 2 years of therapy, electroshock, plus every kind of pill you ever heard of, plus an operation. I'm completely cured. If I wasn't, they wouldn't have let me out.
Here's basically the meat of what I find interesting about Angela in the prequels. She's the product of successful indoctrination and unsuccessful rehabilitation. She references lessons from her aunt at times while giving advice, but in the first film, her killings had nothing to do with the conservative morality that drives her in the sequels. She killed people who hurt and antagonized her. After her time in the mental institution, she kills people who commit moral transgressions or break rules. Her therapy seemingly consisted mainly of attempts to instill a rigid moral code, or to otherwise conform her to social norms. Though she upholds its outcome along with the rest of her treatment, it's impossible to say how much agency she was allowed with regard to her transition. In any case, it seems to take the route that avoids an outcome probably regarded as less desirable at the time. A man raised and socialized for years as a girl, thus somewhat feminine, and who is receptive to or even enthusiastic about sexual attention from the same sex. The justice system and the medical establishment take the Angela from the end of the first film and produce the least objectionable person Reagan's America could ask for, a heterosexual woman with strict conservative morals, with no apparent regard for whether the creation of this socially acceptable Angela actually improved her mental state. The result, the monster in the second and third films, is a mass murderer who kills to uphold those wholesome morals. And with that, of course, we do kind of have to come to the elephant in the room with regard to all of these films, which is, are they transphobic? To which my answer would be, kind of. Obviously, if the twist from the original were done exactly the same way today, it wouldn't fly, and I'd say rightly so. As it is, as something made over 35 years ago, it still leans on the idea of gender variance as something unfamiliar and unsettling to shock the audience, which isn't great, but the film also does nothing to tie that shock to transgender people as an actual existing group of people. And remember, this was decades before the modern controversy over transgender kids. All in all, not great, but not malicious, and not depicting a situation likely to have been associated with actual trans people anyway. The sequels do, however, tie Angela to the reality of trans people by putting her through and then commenting on the actual medical procedures trans people frequently pursue. The implications of Angela's transition as a cure for homosexuality are not unheard of in certain parts of the world, but are also a talking point used to limit access to such procedures for people actively seeking them out. It's all a little iffy, and I should clarify, I know I've kind of gone on about the subversive subtext to these films and the implicit commentary on the legal and medical establishments being used to impose a conservative morality, but these aren't woke films, especially the sequels. Even the third film, in which I don't think Angela's gender is even mentioned, fills out its cast mostly with a collection of stereotypes. Some are benign and kind of amusing, like the dim-witted jock with political ambitions.
I like movies that make America look great. Like Rambo Part 3. Great film.
But others are less so.
Ones with tits and blood.
Riff is the most egregious, as a loud-mouthed, hostile, short-tempered, gun-toting, knife-wielding inner-city black kid who refuses to do anything but blast rap music. He's a lazily conceived character that the movie spends a lot of time on without ever giving him any redeeming qualities. The only time he's depicted as the least bit sympathetic is when he's antagonized by the rich Southern girl.
You dirty...
Yep, she says it. I'm not gonna play it, but she says it. But honestly, the third film is lazy in general. The whole thing was an afterthought, conceived during the filming of Part 2, and then filmed immediately thereafter on the same locations. The kills are often either haphazardly cut down to make them less graphic, boring shit like Angela beating someone with a stick or just shooting them with a gun, or both. But yeah, all in all, these films each have kind of an appeal for me. The original for its uniqueness, and the sequels for the way they fly in the face of that uniqueness. The original is a film I'll probably always defend as genuinely worthwhile and interesting, while the sequels are deeply flawed, often stupid, but in the end entertaining schlock. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at them, and I'm sorry I've generally been away from this channel for so long. I'll be on to the next thing in pretty short order, so stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for watching, and shout out to Exploder Button. I'll see you next time.